The old community center on Maple Street had seen better days. Its paint was chipping, and the wooden floors creaked with every step. But tonight, it was alive with energy. The annual talent show was about to begin, and nearly 200 people had crammed into the auditorium, filling every seat and lining the walls. Backstage, performers paced nervously, running through their routines one last time. A teenage girl practiced her dance moves in the corner. A group of kids from the local school clutched their guitars, whispering encouragement to each other. Everyone was dressed in their best clothes, squints catching the dim backstage lights, ties straightened, makeup carefully applied, and then there was him. He stood apart from the others, quiet and still. His clothes told a different story than everyone else's. The jacket he wore had seen years of use, its elbows worn thin and slightly frayed at the cuffs. His shoes, though clean, were scuffed and practical. While other performers checked their appearances in mirrors and adjusted their outfits, he simply stood there, hands in his pockets. Staring at the floor, most people wouldn't have recognized him in this context, but a few did. He was the janitor. The man who showed up after everyone went home, pushing a mop cart down empty hallways, emptying trash bins, making sure the building was clean for the next day. Some had passed him in the evenings, maybe nodded a greeting. Most had never really looked at him at all. The host, cheerful woman with a clipboard, worked her way down the list of performers. Singers, dancers, a magic act, a comedy routine. The show moved along smoothly, each act receiving polite applause from the audience. Parents recorded their children on phones. Friends cheered for friends. It was wholesome, predictable. It's exactly what everyone expected from a small-town talent show. Then his name was called. He walked onto the stage. Something shifted in the room. Not in a good way. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. People leaned toward each other, whispering, "That's the janitor, isn't he? What's he doing up there? Is this some kind of joke?" The lighting wasn't kind to him. Under the bright stage lights, every detail of his worn clothing became more visible. The contrast between him and the previous performers couldn't have been more obvious. The teenage dancer before him had worn a sparkling costume. The singing group had matching outfits. He looked like he had just walked in from a shift at work, because he had. In the back row, a group of younger people started to snicker. One of them said something and the others laughed, not bothering to lower their voices. The sound carried in the quiet auditorium. A few heads turned to shush them, but the damage was done. The mood in the room had changed. He walked across the stage toward the grand piano that sat center stage. His steps were uncertain, and his shoulders were slightly hunched, as if he was trying to make himself smaller. The piano was beautiful, a genuine concert grand that had been donated to the community center years ago. It was probably the most valuable thing in the entire building. When he reached the piano bench, he stopped. For a moment, he just stood there looking at it. Then he sat down, adjusted the bench, stood up, adjusted it again, and sat back down. His hands gripped the edge of the bench. Even from the back of the auditorium, people could see he was trembling. The whispers grew louder. Someone coughed, the kind of deliberate cough that carries judgment. A few people shifted in their seats, uncomfortable for him, uncomfortable for themselves. It's uncomfortable with the awkwardness of the whole situation. The host stood in the wings, looking at her watch, probably wondering how long she should let this go on. Up in the balcony seating, a middle-aged man leaned over to his wife. "This is painful to watch," he muttered. She nodded but didn't say anything, her eyes fixed on the lonely figure at the piano. The janitor closed his eyes. His breathing was visible, deep breaths, trying to calm himself. His fingers moved from the bench to hover over the keys, not quite touching them yet. The piano gleamed under the lights, its black surface reflecting the stage lights like a dark mirror. More time passed. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. Each second felt longer than the last. The audience's restlessness grew. Programs rustled. Someone's phone buzzed, and they didn't bother to silence it. A child asked their parent in a loud voice, "Why isn't he playing?" In the front row, 3 teenagers who had arrived late sat with their arms crossed. One of them, wearing a Letterman jacket, rolled his eyes dramatically. "Come on," he said. not quite under his breath. His friends laughed again, louder this time. One of them pulled out their phone, probably to record what they assumed would be an embarrassing moment to share later. An older woman in the third row felt her chest tighten. She recognized something in his posture, in the way he sat at that piano. It reminded her of her late husband, who had been a musician. The fear of being judged. The weight of past dreams. She found herself leaning forward, silently willing him to play, to show them whatever it was he had come here to show. But the moments stretched on. The janitor's hands remained frozen above the keys. His eyes were still closed, his face a mask of concentration, or maybe prayer. The uncomfortable silence in the auditorium had transformed into something almost cruel. It felt like the entire room was holding its breath, not in anticipation, but in secondhand embarrassment. The host took a step forward from the wings, ready to intervene if needed. This had gone on too long. People were getting impatient. The whole evening's schedule would be thrown off. She caught the eye of the sound technician, who shrugged helplessly. What were they supposed to do? Some people in the audience actually felt sorry for him. They knew he meant well, probably. Maybe he had played piano as a kid, thought he remembered how, wanted his moment in the spotlight. Everyone has dreams, after all. But this was clearly a mistake. Someone should have told him, should have gently suggested that maybe this wasn't a good idea. Others were less charitable. Their expressions showed irritation, impatience, even contempt. Who did he think he was? Wasting everyone's time like this? They had come here to be entertained, not to sit through whatever this was. The show had been going so well, and now this. The janitor's fingers finally touched the keys, resting on them softly. Still, no sound came. His head bowed lower, and for a terrible moment, it seemed like he might stand up and walk away. Defeated before he even began, the teenager with the phone in the front row zoomed in, finger poised over the record button. The moment was ready to be captured, shared, turned into a story they would tell later. Remember that time the janitor tried to play piano at the talent show? The entire auditorium had become a pressure cooker of anticipation, mockery, pity, and judgment, all swirling together. 200 people, each with their own assumptions about what was about to happen. Each certain they knew how this story would end. Not a single person in that room knew what was actually coming. The janitor took one more deep breath. His trembling stopped. Something changed in his posture. Something subtle but profound. His shoulders settled. His back straightened, just slightly. And his fingers, those worn working hands that had mopped floors and emptied trash for years, began to move. What happened next would change everything. The first note cut through the silence like a knife through butter. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was pure and clear and absolutely perfect. Then came the second note and the third. And suddenly the entire auditorium was holding its breath for a completely different reason. The laughter died in the throats. Of the teenagers in the front row, the man in the balcony stopped mid-whisper to his wife. The host, who had been about to step onto the stage to rescue him from embarrassment, froze in place, her hand gripping the curtain. What poured out of that piano was not what anyone expected. These weren't the fumbling notes of an amateur who had learned to play as a child. This wasn't a simple melody pecked out with 2 fingers. This was something else entirely. His hands moved across the keys like water flowing downstream, natural and inevitable. The left hand laid down deep, rich bass notes that seemed to vibrate through the wooden floor of the old auditorium. The right hand danced over the higher keys, creating a melody so beautiful it seemed impossible that human fingers could move that fast. That precisely, the piece he was playing was complex. The kind of music that concert pianists spend years mastering. Notes cascaded over each other in waves, building and falling, soft then powerful, gentle then commanding. Every single note was exactly where it needed to be, not a moment too soon or too late. The teenager who had been recording on his phone slowly lowered it. His finger had never pressed the record button. He was too stunned to remember why he had taken the phone out in the first place. His mouth hung open slightly, and he didn't notice. Around the auditorium, people's faces began to change. The skepticism melted away. The pity evaporated. The impatience transformed into something that looked almost like shock. Because what they were witnessing wasn't just good, it was extraordinary. The janitor's entire body had transformed. The nervous, trembling man who had shuffled onto the stage was gone. In his place sat someone completely different. His back was straight now, his shoulders relaxed. His head swayed slightly with the music, feeling every note, living inside every phrase. His eyes remained closed, but his face showed an expression of deep peace. As if he had finally come home after a long journey, his fingers flew across the keys, executing runs and trills that would challenge professional musicians. Complex passages that required both hands to cross over each other flowed out effortlessly. The dynamic shifted from whisper-soft to thunderously powerful, and every change felt intentional, meaningful. Like he was telling a story without words. In the third row, the elderly woman who had felt sorry for him moments ago now had tears streaming down her face. She knew this piece. Her late husband had tried to learn it once, had practiced for months, and never quite got it right. She knew how difficult it was. She knew what she was hearing was something rare and precious. A mother who had brought her to young children thinking this would be a forgettable evening of community entertainment found herself leaning forward in her seat. Her kids, who had been fidgeting and whispering, sat perfectly still, mesmerized by the sound. The younger one tugged on her sleeve and whispered, "Mommy, is he magic?" The music filled every corner of the auditorium. It reached into the back rows, where people had been chatting quietly. It climbed up to the balcony, where latecomers had been checking their phones. It wrapped around the hearts of everyone present, demanding their attention, refusing to be ignored. The piece moved into a slower section, and the janitor's playing became tender, almost fragile. Single notes hung in the air like dewdrops, each one precious. His right hand picked out a melody so achingly beautiful that several more people in the audience found themselves wiping their eyes. The left hand provided a gentle accompaniment, supporting but never overwhelming. Backstage, the other performers had gathered in the wings to watch. The teenage dancer stood with her hand over her mouth. The guitar players had set down their instruments. Every single person was transfixed. The sound technician, who had worked hundreds of shows in this building over the years, stood with his headphones around his neck, tears on his cheeks, shaking his head in disbelief. Then the music began to build again. The gentle section gave way to something more urgent, more passionate. The janitor's hands began to move faster, the notes coming in a torrent now. His whole upper body moved with the music, rocking slightly, channeling something deep and powerful through his fingers into the piano. The old piano itself seemed to come alive under his touch. It was as if the instrument had been waiting years for someone who could truly play it, who could draw out all the sound it was capable of making. The notes rang out clear and true, filling the space with a richness that made the air itself seem to vibrate. People in the audience had forgotten to breathe. The man in the balcony, who had complained to his wife now, sat with his hands gripped together, his eyes wide. The wife had tears running down her face. She didn't bother to wipe them away. The three teenagers in the front row looked like they had been slapped. All the smugness, all the superiority, all the cruel amusement had been stripped away. They sat small in their seats now, witnessing something that made them feel ashamed of their earlier behavior. Though they couldn't quite put that feeling into words yet, as the piece moved toward its climax, the janitor's playing became even more intense. His fingers struck the keys with purpose and power, drawing out chords that seemed to shake the walls. The music swelled and grew, building to something that felt almost unbearable in its beauty and intensity. And then, something unexpected happened. A single tear rolled down the janitor's cheek, then another. His eyes were still closed, and his playing never faltered, not for a single note. But the tears came steadily now, flowing freely as his hands continued their dance across the keys. He wasn't crying from sadness or from fear. He was crying from the sheer release of it all, from the emotion of the music. From years of something held back finally being let out. The audience saw this, and many of them began crying too. They didn't fully understand why. They didn't know his story, didn't know what had brought him to this moment. but they could feel it in the music. Pain and joy mixed together, loss and hope intertwined, a lifetime of experience channeled through 88 black and white keys. The music told stories that words never could. It spoke of dreams deferred and sacrifices made, of beautiful things set aside and precious things protected, of silent nights and empty halls and hands that remembered what they once knew, of a fire that had never quite gone out, no matter how much time had passed. Every person in that auditorium was on a journey now, carried along by the music. They had walked in as an audience, ready to be entertained, maybe to judge, certainly to pass the time. They were being transformed into witnesses of something profound, something real, something that would stay with them long after this night ended. The janitor played on, tears still flowing, completely lost in the music. His worn jacket and scuffed shoes didn't matter anymore. The mops and trash bins and late-night shifts had faded away. In this moment, he wasn't a janitor at all. He was what he had always been, underneath everything else. He was a musician. The music shifted again, moving into a section that felt like a conversation between two voices. The left hand asked questions in deep, rumbling tones. The right hand answered with bright, soaring melodies. Back and forth they went, speaking to each other. Sometimes agreeing, sometimes arguing, always connected. The janitor's face showed every emotion the music carried. When the melody climbed higher, hope flickered across his features. When it descended into darker passages, pain creased his forehead. He wasn't just playing the notes. He was living them, breathing them, pouring something essential from deep inside himself into every phrase in the fifth row. Music teacher who had taught piano for 30 years sat absolutely still. She had heard this piece performed countless times by her students, by professionals in concert halls, even by renowned masters on recordings. But she had never heard it played like this. This wasn't technical perfection alone, though the technique was flawless. This was something more. This was truth. Her mind raced with questions. Where had he trained? Who had taught him? How long had he been playing? And the biggest question of all, the one that made her chest ache, why was someone with this much talent working as a janitor? The answer, she somehow sensed, was in the music itself. The piece moved into its most demanding section, a passage where both hands had to move in opposite directions at impossible speeds, creating a cascade of notes that sounded like a waterfall made of light. The janitor's fingers were a blur. His hands crossed over each other, reaching for keys at opposite ends of the piano, never missing, never hesitating. A young man in the back row who had studied piano for 8 years before giving it up in frustration felt something break open inside his chest. He had struggled with this exact section, had practiced it until his fingers ached, had never been able to play it smoothly. Watching someone execute it so effortlessly, with such grace and power, made him realize how much he had missed the instrument, how much he had given up. The auditorium had become a sacred space. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seats. Even the children sat motionless, sensing that something important was happening, something they might not fully understand but could definitely feel. The air itself seemed to hold still, waiting. The janitor's tears continued to fall, dropping onto his worn jacket, but his playing grew stronger. The sorrow in the music began to transform. Like clouds parting after a storm, rays of something brighter started breaking through. The notes that had been heavy with grief began to lift, to lighten, to reach toward something higher. This shift in the music affected everyone differently. The elderly woman in the third row thought of her husband, gone 10 years now. And for the first time since his death, she felt something other than loss. She felt gratitude for the time they had shared. The mother with the 2 children thought of all the sacrifices she had made, all the dreams she had set aside, and instead of resentment, she felt a strange pride. The teenagers in the front row felt something unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Shame, yes, but also something deeper. They were being forced to see someone they had dismissed, someone they had mocked, as fully human. More than that, as exceptional. As someone who possessed something they could never touch, no matter how popular they were, or how many followers they had, or how much their clothes cost. The music swelled toward what felt like it might be the ending. The notes gathered momentum, building like a wave rolling toward shore. The janitor's whole body moved with the music now, swaying, lifting slightly off the bench with the force of his playing. His face had transformed completely. The fear was gone. The nervousness had vanished. He looked almost radiant, lit from within by something the audience could feel but not name. Just when everyone thought the piece would crash to its conclusion, the janitor did something unexpected. He suddenly pulled back, letting the volume drop to almost nothing. The music became a whisper, intimate and personal. Single notes played so softly they barely disturbed the air, created a melody of such tender beauty that it felt like he was sharing a secret with each person individually. The host stood in the wings with her, hand pressed against her heart. She had organized this talent show for 7 years, had seen hundreds of performances. Nothing had ever affected her like this. She looked down at her clipboard, at the neat list of performers and their planned acts, and realized how little those details mattered. How little any of the planning and organizing mattered compared to this moment of raw, honest artistry. The soft section continued, drawing everyone closer, making them lean in to hear every delicate note. The janitor's fingers moved with incredible lightness now, barely touching the keys, coaxing out sounds that seemed to float rather than fall. His face was peaceful despite the tears, showing a kind of joy mixed with sorrow that comes from touching something true. Then gradually, he began to build again. Note by note, the volume increased. The complexity grew. The passion intensified. But this time, it felt different. There was no darkness in it now, only light. The music spoke of struggle, yes, but also of overcoming, of loss, but also of what remains, of sacrifice, but also of love that makes sacrifice worthwhile. The sound filled the auditorium until it seemed the walls themselves were singing. The old building, with its chipped paint and creaking floors, had become a cathedral. The shabby stage with its worn curtains had become a platform for something holy. And the man at the piano, with his frayed jacket and scuffed shoes, had become what he truly was, a master of his craft. People's faces showed a mixture of awe and confusion, and something close to reverence. They had come here expecting amateur hour, a pleasant evening of mediocre talent and supportive applause. They had been prepared to smile politely and clap encouragingly. They had not been prepared for greatness. They had not been prepared to witness its excellence in a form this pure. The music teacher in the 5th row finally understood something. Whoever this man was, whatever his story might be, he had made a choice at some point. He had chosen something else over his music. The playing told her that much. You could hear in every note the years of practice, the countless hours of dedication it took to reach this level. And you could also hear the gap, the years away. It's a silence that had come between then and now. But what the music also told her, what it told everyone listening, was that some things cannot be taken away. Some gifts run too deep. This man had set aside his piano, maybe for years, maybe for decades. But the piano had never left him. The music had stayed in his fingers, in his heart, in his soul. It's waiting for a moment exactly like this. The piece was racing toward its true ending now. The notes came faster and faster, building to a climax that felt both inevitable and impossible. The janitor's hands moved with absolute certainty, absolute precision, drawing out every ounce of sound the piano could give. And then, with a final cascade of notes that seemed to shimmer in the air like stars, the music ended. His hands came to rest on the keys. The last note hung in the silence, and time itself seemed to stop. The silence lasted 3 heartbeats. Then the auditorium exploded. It started with one person standing up, then another, then 5 more. Within seconds, the entire crowd was on their feet, and the sound of their applause was like thunder rolling through the old building. People weren't just clapping. They were cheering, shouting, some with their hands raised above their heads, applauding so hard their palms turned red. The janitor opened his eyes slowly, as if waking from a deep dream. He looked out at the standing crowd with an expression of complete bewilderment. His hands were still resting on the piano keys, trembling slightly now that the music had stopped. He seemed genuinely surprised to find himself on a stage, in front of all these people, receiving this response. The applause didn't stop. It grew louder. People in the back rows were whistling. The elderly woman in the third row was clapping with tears streaming down her face, not bothering to wipe them away. The music teacher was shaking her head in disbelief, applauding until her hands hurt. The teenagers in the front row stood with the rest, clapping hard, their earlier mockery completely forgotten, or perhaps remembered all too well. The one who had pulled out his phone to record what he thought would be an embarrassment now wished desperately that he had actually pressed record. No one would believe this. He barely believed it himself. The janitor stood up from the bench, awkward again now that the music had ended. He gave a small, shy bow, the kind of gesture someone makes when they're not used to being looked at, not used to being seen. The applause somehow intensified. People were calling out words of appreciation, though their voices were lost in the general roar of approval. He took a step back from the piano, clearly ready to leave the stage. But the crowd wasn't ready to let him go. The applause continued, demanding more, demanding an explanation, demanding something to help them understand what they had just experienced. The host, still standing in the wings with her clipboard hanging forgotten at her side, suddenly remembered her role. She rushed onto the stage, microphone in hand, her own eyes red from crying. She reached the janitor just as he was about to disappear behind the curtain.
"I'll wait, please," she said.
Her voice amplified through the speakers. The crowd's applause began to fade, people eager to hear what would be said. "Please stay for just a moment." The janitor stopped, looking uncomfortable under the bright lights and the stares of 200 people. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his worn jacket, trying to compose himself. "That was incredible," the host said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think everyone here would agree that was the most beautiful performance we've ever witnessed in this building." More applause erupted, confirming her words. She waited for it to die down before continuing. "Can you tell us, where did you learn to play like that?" The janitor looked at the microphone like it was a dangerous animal. He shook his head slightly, his mouth opening and closing without words coming out. He wasn't being difficult. He simply seemed unable to speak, as if he had poured everything he had to say into the music and had nothing left for words. "Please," the host said gently. "Everyone here wants to know your story." The crowd murmured in agreement. The auditorium had gone quiet again, everyone leaning forward, waiting. The janitor's eyes swept across the sea of faces, all looking at him with expressions so different from what he had seen when he first walked onto the stage. Where there had been mockery, there was now respect. Where there had been pity, there was now admiration. Where there had been dismissal, there was now genuine curiosity. He opened his mouth. For a moment it seemed like he might actually speak. But then he simply shook his head again, gave another small bow, and turned to leave. The host reached out as if to stop him, but then let her hand fall. Something in his expression told her that pushing would be wrong, that this man had already given everything he could give tonight. The janitor walked off the stage, and the curtain fell behind him. The audience erupted in applause again, even though he was gone. They stood clapping for a full minute more, applauding an empty stage, honoring a performance that had moved them in ways they were still trying to understand. Backstage, the other performers parted to let him through. They looked at him with new eyes, seeing someone completely different from the quiet man who had been standing in the corner earlier. The teenage dancer touched his arm gently as he passed. "That was amazing," she whispered. He nodded, but didn't stop walking. The host returned to the microphone, trying to regain control of the show. "Let's hear it one more time for that extraordinary performance," she said, and the crowd obliged with another round of thunderous applause. "We'll be taking a brief intermission now." But no one wanted to leave their seats. The auditorium buzzed with conversation. Everyone was talking about what they had just witnessed. People who had never met were turning to each other, sharing their reactions, trying to process the experience together. "Did you know he could play like that?" A man asked the stranger sitting next to him. "Had no idea," the stranger replied. "I see him here all the time. He's always just been the janitor." "Not anymore," the man said quietly. "Not anymore." The music teacher made her way through the crowd, trying to find someone who might know more about the janitor. She stopped a board member of the community center. Do you know anything about him? Where he came from? How long he's worked here?" The board member shrugged helplessly. "Maybe 5 years? 6? He keeps to himself. Always does good work, never misses a shift. But I don't know anything about his background. I don't think anyone does." In the lobby, people were checking their phones, searching for videos of the performance, hoping someone had recorded it. But everyone had been too captivated to think about recording. They had been too busy experiencing it to think about documenting it. The teenagers from the front row stood in a small circle, unusually quiet. Finally, one of them spoke. "We were going to laugh at him." The others nodded, not meeting each other's eyes. "We're jerks," another one said softly. "Yeah," the first one agreed. "We really are." They stood there for a moment longer, each dealing with the uncomfortable realization that they had judged someone completely wrong, that they had almost missed something beautiful because of their own prejudices and assumptions. Meanwhile, in the empty backstage area, the janitor sat alone in a corner, his head in his hands. His whole body was shaking, but not from fear anymore. It was the aftershock of what he had just done, of the risk he had taken, the part of himself he had revealed after keeping it hidden for so long. He hadn't planned to do this. When he signed up for the talent show 3 weeks ago, he had almost talked himself out of it a dozen times. Every day leading up to tonight, he had thought about withdrawing his name from the list. Even as he walked onto that stage, part of him had wanted to turn around and run, but something had made him stay. Something had made him sit down at that piano and play. And now that he had done it, now that he had let people see this part of him, everything felt different. Raw, exposed, terrifying and liberating at the same time. He took a deep breath and stood up. His shift started in an hour. The building would need to be cleaned after everyone went home. The floors would need mopping, the trash would need emptying. Life would go back to normal, except nothing would ever be normal again. The next morning, the janitor arrived at the community center, expecting everything to be the same as it always was. He parked his old car in the back lot, pulled out his keys, and headed toward the employee entrance. The sun was just coming up, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. But things were not the same. Small group of people was waiting by the front doors. When they saw him, they started walking toward him. His first instinct was to turn around, to get back in his car and leave. But his feet kept moving forward, almost against his will. The music teacher was there, along with 2 members of the community center board. They approached him with careful smiles, as if afraid he might bolt like a frightened animal. "We're sorry to ambush you like this," the music teacher said, "but we couldn't stop thinking about last night." "About your performance?" The janitor shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking at the ground. "It was just a talent show," he said quietly. "No," one of the board members said firmly. "It wasn't just anything. What we witnessed last night was extraordinary. And we have questions. Would you be willing to talk with us? Just for a few minutes?" He hesitated, then nodded once. They moved to a bench near the entrance, and he sat down, still not quite making eye contact. "Where did you train?" the music teacher asked gently. The janitor was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Conservatory. In Europe, a long time ago." "You were a professional musician," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. "I played in concert halls. Small ones at first, then bigger venues. I had a career starting. People said I had a future. What happened?" the board member asked. The janitor's hands clasped together tightly. "My daughter got sick, very sick. She was only 7 years old." His voice cracked slightly. "The treatments she needed, they weren't available here. We had to go to specialists, try experimental procedures. Insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough." The group sat in silence, letting him continue at his own pace. "I had to choose," he said simply. "Keep pursuing music, keep performing, keep building a career that might pay off someday. Or get a steady job, multiple jobs, anything that would pay the bills and give her a chance." "There was no choice at all," the music teacher said softly. "No," he agreed. "There wasn't. so I stopped performing. Stopped going to auditions, started working. I drove trucks for a while, worked construction, did whatever paid. Eventually ended up here, cleaning buildings at night. The hours worked well because I could take her to appointments during the day. Your daughter, one of the board members asked carefully. Is she? A small smile crossed the janitor's face, the first real smile they had seen. She's fine, healthy. She's in medical school now, actually. Wants to help other kids like her? Does she know? The music teacher asked. Does she know what you gave up for her? He shook his head quickly. No, and I don't want her to. She was so young when she was sick. She doesn't remember much of it. I told her I worked in music education, that I chose to step back from performing. She thinks I made a lifestyle choice, not a sacrifice. I want to keep it that way. But your gift, the music teacher said, her voice urgent. You can't just let it go to waste. Last night proved you still have it. You could perform again, teach, do something with this talent. The janitor looked up at the sky, watching the colors change as the sun rose higher. I haven't wasted it, he said. For 20 years, late at night after my shifts, I've been coming to this building and playing that piano. When everyone's gone home and the building is quiet, I practice. I play for myself, for the empty halls. I never stopped being a musician. I just stopped being a public one. Till last night, the board member said. Till last night, he echoed. I don't know why I signed up. Maybe I just needed to know if I could still do it. If I could still play in front of people. If it would still mean something. It meant everything, the music teacher said emphatically. You saw their faces. You heard that applause. You moved people in a way that most musicians never do in their entire careers. He nodded slowly. I felt it. It was like coming back to life after being underwater for a long time. Scary and wonderful at the same time. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then the board member spoke. We have a proposal. The community center has been wanting to start a music program for underprivileged kids. Children whose families can't afford private lessons. We've had the idea for years but never found the right person to run it. The janitor looked at him with raised eyebrows. We'd like to offer you the position, the board member continued. You could teach piano, run group classes, maybe put on recitals. It wouldn't pay as much as performing in concert halls, but it would be steady, and you'd be using your gift. Teaching children, the janitor said slowly, testing the words. Kids who might never get a chance to learn otherwise, the music teacher added. Kids who might have the same gift you do, but no way to develop it. You could change lives. The janitor sat with this for a long time. The sun had fully risen now, and people were starting to arrive at the community center for morning classes. Some of them recognized him from the talent show and waved. He waved back, still getting used to being seen. I'd like that, he finally said. I'd like that very much. The music teacher smiled widely. There's one condition, though. Once a year, on the anniversary of last night, you have to perform. One piece. To remind yourself and everyone else what you're capable of. He considered this, then nodded. I can do that. Over the following weeks, word spread through the community about the talent show performance and the janitor's new role. The local newspaper ran a small story. People who had been there told friends who told other friends. The legend grew with each telling. Children started signing up for the new music program in numbers that surprised everyone. The waiting list grew long. Parents who had never thought about music lessons for their kids suddenly saw it as possible, as something valuable. The janitor, now officially the community center's music director, threw himself into teaching with the same passion he had once brought to performing. He was patient with struggling students, encouraging with talented ones, and generous with all of them. He saw in each child the possibility of greatness, the potential for their own gift to emerge if given the chance. Sometimes, late at night after his classes were done, he would still sit at that grand piano and play for himself. The building was different now, filled with the sounds of children learning scales during the day, but in the quiet hours. It was his again. He had learned something important that night of the talent show. He had learned that sacrifice doesn't diminish a gift, that stepping away doesn't mean giving up, that sometimes the most meaningful way to use a talent isn't on a concert stage for thousands of people, but in a community center for dozens of children who needed someone to believe in them. And every year, on that anniversary, he would perform one piece. The auditorium would fill with people who had heard the story, people who wanted to witness something beautiful. And he would play, tears still flowing, sharing his gift with the world for one night. Before returning to the quieter work of nurturing gifts in others, the crowd never mocked him again.